Hi, I'm Todd Wood. I'm president of Core Academy of Science. I love to talk about human origins and hominin fossils, and this is Fossil Focus. So today we're going to look at this particular peculiar fossil here. This is, well, we'll just call it 1470. KNM ER 1470. It is very interesting. It was found in 1972 at a place that was designated Area 131, which is near Kubai on the eastern side of Lake Turkana in northern Kenya. If you want to keep track of all this stuff, it's basically right across the lake from where Academy was found. So it's near Kubai as well. It was found in many different pieces and it was reassembled. The bones that were found along at the same time, they were on the surface along with the skull bits, but there was enough matrix left attached to the fossil itself that the scientists could basically figure out exactly where it came from. They could match the minerals still attached to the bone to the minerals on the hillside and figure out where it came from. The conventional date on this thing is about 2 million years, which is old. It's older than, say, the oldest definitely dated Homo erectus fossils, but it's not that old. It's not as old as some of the other hominins that we know about. So the fossil was found, as I said, in 1972. It was described the following year by Richard Leakey in a paper in Nature. And he describes briefly the circumstances of its discovery and what was found with regard to what pieces were found. So basically you have most of the top of the brain case, we have the eye sockets as well, and pieces of the facial bones here. But a lot of this has been reconstructed to put it together. The bottom in particular is poorly represented, although the palate, as we shall come to see, is something that is preserved and is fairly diagnostic. You'll note here some of the characteristics that define this skull. We have the very minimal brow ridge here. Unlike, for example, something that you might see at Academy boy, Homo erectus, classical Homo erectus, with a much heavier brow ridge. Even Neanderthals have a heavier brow ridge than this guy. So this is pretty different from other things that we see in the fossil record. And as I mentioned, the mouth is also pretty weird. The front of its mouth is fairly flat, as if someone just sort of pushed in your mouth and made it sort of flat. Now, with regard to the reconstruction here, I do want to mention that Leakey emphasized that the bones all connect together. So it's not as if you could just imaginatively reconstruct this in some wildly different configuration. He seemed fairly certain, and looking at his original photographs of the original fossil, it does seem reasonable that these pieces, the bones, do somewhat fit together like pieces of a puzzle, and so this is pretty good in terms of a reconstruction. So, what is it? That's the big question. Is it Homo erectus? Is it a really old example of Homo erectus? Is it Australopithecus? Is it Homo habilis, like the finds from Olduvai down farther south in Tanzania? And what I thought was interesting about this is something that I've known about for a long time, and people have talked about sort of the different classifications that anthropologists give to this skull. The original paper that Leakey published in '73 did not give a definitive classification to the skull at all. So 1470, he simply said, was probably a member of the genus Homo, but he was unwilling to formally attribute the skull to any particular species, nor did he erect a new species for it. Now, the thing that makes it different from Australopithecus, and that prevents it from being in there really, was basically the brain case itself. It's considerably bigger than the typical brain case of Australopithecus. So this was, it's about 800 cubic centimeters, which puts it maybe 2/3 of the average size of a modern adult human being. So this puts it considerably above twice as much, maybe more than twice as much as a chimpanzee, and considerably bigger than Australopithecus. It's about 1/3 bigger than the typical Homo habilis skull that was coming out of Olduvai. Nevertheless, you got to call it something, right? And people began to just sort of assume that this went into the category of Homo habilis, the same as what was coming out of Olduvai, because it was large-brained, it was Homo, and so there was this assumption that this was probably Homo habilis. But again, that wasn't a formal classification. That wasn't anybody stepping forward and saying, here are all the characteristics that fit Homo habilis, and this is what a definition of Homo habilis would look like. So that led to discussion. And in the 80s, people began to propose the idea that Homo habilis was what we might call a trash can classification, where things were just thrown without really any regard to exactly what it was. And so we have, towards the end of the 80s, Colin Groves publishing his description of the various species of Homo, and he says that this should be classified in a group, a species with a couple of other skull fragments that he called Homo rudolfensis, using a name that had been proposed in a fairly weird book by a Soviet paleoanthropologist named Valery Alexeyev. So that's how this guy comes to be known by the name rudolfensis, which is, if there is anything common in anthropology for specimens like this, that's probably the most common classification of this, is Homo rudolfensis. But the question remains, when you have fragmentary fossils like this, and when you don't have a lot of corroborating evidence, the question is this really representative of a different species, or is it, for example, an aberrant growth form of something we already know? Does it simply exhibit the range of variation in something we already know about? It's basically a problem of sample size, right? Can you take a single really fragmentary skull like this and extrapolate to a full species? And so how does one resolve these kinds of questions? Well, one needs additional samples. You need to increase your sample size, and that means additional excavations. And so in 2012, we had new fossils published that somewhat tend to corroborate the existence of something that is consistent with Homo rudolfensis. And I'm sort of hedging the way I describe this. The morphology of these new remains are consistent with what we see here. And it's still a small sample size, but it's a little better than it was before. So we have a little more confidence that maybe this is something real. So this particular specimen here, KNM ER 62,000, and what makes this one corroborating of what we've seen prior is the fact that we have that very flat front of the mouth. The palate is preserved pretty well, and you can see it's pretty flat. And when you look at the profile of this thing, you can see that's also fairly flat. So that weird flatness that's only really seen in skull 1470, we now see it as well here in ER 62,000. And in ER 60,000, we have a mandible, jawbone, and we have a very similar flat tooth row here at the top. Even though it's a little distorted, it's quite a bit flatter than it would be otherwise. And so now we can sort of imagine something of what this might look like when you put it all together. And yeah, it's a very flat face. It is not like Homo erectus. It is not like Australopithecus. It is definitely unique and different. So, as a creationist, what do we do with fossils like this? Well, the first thing that we do is we acknowledge the evidence here is fairly limited, much like it is with, say, Australopithecus sediba. Actually, it's quite a bit more limited than sediba. But what we can say then is going to have to be qualified, and we have to be careful that we don't draw too much confidence or put too much confidence into these results. So what can you say? Well, my analysis seems to confirm that this is human. Now, my analysis is based on craniodental characters, so characters of the skull and of the teeth and of the mandible. So it's not as good as it could be if I looked at the whole body. But then again, we don't really have the whole body of this guy, so even if I did look at the whole body, I still wouldn't be able to tell any more than what I can tell just from the craniodental characters. And I would note that early on, when this fossil first appeared, creationists considered it carefully, and they were somewhat confident that it was human, as I would say for my analysis. Although now there are those who would argue that it is not human, that it is in fact something called Kenyanthropus, although I do not find that association between the fossils of Kenyanthropus and the fossils of associated with 1470, I don't find that that's a very convincing association. So my understanding would be that this is human. So then the next question is, when did it live? You know, we don't, 2 million years, that's the radiometric way of thinking. How would we put this into sort of a biblical time frame? And considering the kinds of layers of sediment and material that you find fossils like this in, and these particular fossils, my assessment would be that this is something after the flood. These kinds of fossil layers are fairly localized. They are not widespread like you see with flood-formed rock layers. They're not giant like you see with flood-formed rock layers. So my understanding of these fossils would be that they're, after the flood, people who are colonizing the earth, probably after the Tower of Babel. So these are possibly some of Noah's close family members here that were caught in maybe a flood, a local flood, or a volcanic eruption or something like that, and they got killed and eventually buried where we dug them up later. So that's my reading of the fossils. I hope you enjoyed this. If you did, hey, click on the subscribe button. You click the bell if you want notifications when we post new things. Check us out at coresci.org for more information, and thanks for watching.